Thy gifts to us mortals fulfill all our needs, and yet run back to Thee undiminished. Welcome to Sapien Podcast. Our today's guest is Dr. Marcia Eckerd, is a distinguished psychologist with over 35 years of experience specializing in autism spectrum disorders and anxiety on ADHD. She has dedicated herself to working with neurodiverse clients, providing innovative and creative therapeutic methods. Today, we are honored to have her here with us. A lot of people out there, and to some extent, including me, that we don't really understand what ADHD is really. It's a behavioral manifestation of something that is going on inside the brain. However, we don't really understand that how it's happening, why it's happening, and what are the different ways that these behaviors can manifest itself. So if you could actually start with that, that would be very helpful.
Okay, I'd like to start with what you said,
Okay.
because I think that there's an entire approach that is developing traction these days called the neurodiversity. And when you think about it, we expect all kinds of diversity among people. People have different color skin, we have different color hair, we have different talents. There's some people who are 7 feet tall and a gymnast who's 4'8". We have people who are, phenomenal music prodigies and people who can't carry a tune. And in the natural world, we have enormous diversity. We don't expect every tree to be a maple tree, and we don't call an oak tree a broken maple tree. So when we talk about and I'm going to call it neuropsychological differences, I mean, I don't think we have the science yet to say we can pinpoint exactly the neurology. There's a lot of studies and there's a lot that's been done, but it's not, I don't think, at the level of the average person, having access to this is what it is. But to think about the idea that the way we process the world is all of a sudden the one thing that has to be, there's only one way to do it or it's a disability. There's only one way to do it or it's pathological. And people who are ADHD, people who are on the autistic spectrum, people who have nonverbal learning disabilities like Tim Walsh's son, all have a different way of processing the world. They take in the world differently. They respond to the world differently. But to say that that's a pathology is to say that everybody has to do it the same way. So I think that when we think about ADHD, so many people with ADHD, I'll give it an example is John Irvine, who is a very, very famous writer. In school, he was told he was stupid and he would never amount to anything because, from what I gather, he was dyslexic. And from what I gather, he may or may not have had ADHD, but in any case, he was different. And if you're different, people think that there's something fundamentally wrong with you, when in fact, you may be very bright, very creative, and have all kinds of things to contribute that people who are processing differently don't contribute. So I want to sort of shift and talk about ADHD and whatever else we might talk about, not from the perspective that we are talking about pathology alone, that we are talking about people who are broken versions of normal, but rather people who sort of are wired to process in a different way. So all of that said, which is a lot, there are basically two kinds or three kinds of ADHD that people talk about. One is inattentive, where the ability to sustain attention is challenged, and people who are inattentive can seem to be in their own world or daydreaming sometimes. They have difficulty with executive functions like keeping things organized and kind of being able to inhibit being distracted. But it's primarily around attention. The other kind is hyperactivity. So when you have attention deficit hyperactivity, those are the kids who are, bouncing off of everything and need constant sort of stimulation and are hyperactive compared to the activity level we expect. Although I think that sometimes these days what we expect is pretty strange in and of itself. I had someone who came to me saying that there's a 5-year-old was, probably had ADHD because he wasn't sitting quietly in circle time in school. And I said, he's not sitting quietly in circle time because he's 5 years old. Being 5 isn't a disability.
Right.
But and then there's another kind of ADHD called combined, where you both have issues with attention and hyperactivity. An interesting thing about ADHD is that much of what we know about it in terms of the kind of issues of distractibility, of how people have emotional regulation, the fact that sometimes people are quick to react or, impulsive to react, the kind of things that we look for are all based on studies of males. In ADHD, like so much else in medicine and in other fields, they only studied boys, and they studied prepubescent boys. So there's very little known, or it's just starting to be talked about ADHD in girls. And specifically also what impact hormones have on how ADHD presents in girls. So you've opened up a whole can of worms here, because we're not only talking about kids who are, when most people are focusing and they're like, they have blinders on, they're just focusing straight on what they're being told to focus on. The person who has ADHD's focus is much wider. They're taking a lot more in, and that means they may not be focusing exactly where you want them to focus. But on the other hand, they're kind of out of the box because they've got so much more that's coming in. They may be having ideas that other people aren't having because their focus is so narrow. So while if what you want is for a child to hold still and read, and you have a child with ADHD where sustaining attention is a problem or hyperactivity is a problem, he may have trouble holding still. He may have trouble remembering what he read. He may have to read it and then reread it and then reread it before the information really sticks, because it's hard to sustain attention. Or he may be sort of wiggly squiggly and can only hold still long enough to say read part of it. So that's kind of what we think of when we think of ADHD. We also think of kids who are maybe impulsive. They talk out in class, they blurt out, they're raising their hands. And girls aren't picked up as early because there's more attention inattention in girls. And so girls who seem to be inattentive are also often that said, well, they're just, their minds are on other things. They're too social. They're thinking about boys, or they're thinking about whatever gender they're thinking about. And it's kind of more blamed on them that they're not motivated, rather than that they have ADHD, unless somebody actually explores ADHD as a possibility they have checklists that parents and teachers and kids fill out about, paying attention and being distracted and being able to have working memory, being able to sort of inhibit behavior, all these kinds of things, to say, does somebody have enough criteria of ADHD to meet the diagnosis? Another thing that's interesting is that I say kids because we're often talking about starting it. We see it as kids. Um, they also, what we call comorbid. It coexists with all kinds of other things. We tend to think of diagnoses and that's who you are. And really, a diagnosis just describes a part of who you are. It describes something that may be a very important part of you are that has to be, that gives us a way to be helpful. But many kids who have ADHD are also on the spectrum, or they also may have sensory issues, or they may also have learning issues. They may be very talented in some field. There are kids who are called twice exceptional, meaning that they have some issue like ADHD or being on the spectrum or learning issue, and they're extremely smart. They're gifted. So when you do research and you throw out everybody who has ADHD and something, and you only look at the kids who only have ADHD, you're really throwing out most people because people who come into my office tend to be pretty complicated and you've got more than one thing going on. So but one of the issues for kids with ADHD is that they are often blamed for their behavior. In other words, you should sit still. If you look at the sign they have on walls in kindergartens, it says quiet, eyes, ears, quiet hands, quiet body. And if you're wired to have a wiggly body and to have trouble, holding still and having your hands be quiet, and sustaining your attention is difficult unless it's really interesting, the kid's going to fail the poster. And we tend to blame the kid for it and then say to the parent, Johnny isn't doing what we want him to do, instead of understanding that maybe Johnny has to move around in order to listen. Or maybe Johnny has to, have a quiet background in order to listen because he's distracted by sounds. So I think that understanding not only the issues of ADHD, that the person has executive functions, as I talked about, like beginning to start something, being able to sustain your effort, being able to inhibit distractibility, being able to prioritize and organize, being able to organize materials. All these things are executive functions. And if you think about executive functions, including being able to transition from one thing to another or multitask, so to speak, if it's very difficult if you have ADHD to do that and sustain your working memory. Your working memory is having things stay in your mind as you're doing something. So if you have trouble working memory and you're writing, it's a perfect storm because you have to think about what you asked me. I have to think about what I want to say. I have to think about how to put it into a grammatical sentence. I have to remember how to spell the sentence. I have to be able to write it down. I need to be able to check back to make sure this sentence said what I wanted it to say. I have to think about the next sentence. And that's a lot of transitions. That's a lot of organization. That's a lot of working memory. And so when you think about one of the challenges, you don't think about writing. But in fact, writing can be a challenge because there's so much working memory and so much transition involved. So there are issues with ADHD that are challenges that people don't think about. But also people with ADHD are out of the box creative. And that, if you go to something like Saturday Night Live, probably a lot of the writers have ADHD because these are people who are thinking of things who other people aren't thinking of. So when we talk about a neurological pathology, I'm going to say, hey, let's broaden our vision here to look at the challenges, but also to look at the strengths.
Okay. So, instead of pathology, you actually wanted to use the neurodiversity in that sense so that it can encompass and include all these different types of diversity, neurological diversity that otherwise we'll call pathology with the lack of better understanding. So that could be included. So that makes sense. I was actually thinking about, when you said Saturday Night Live, I actually watch a lot of them. And it makes sense that they are so creative for sure. Does it actually, a certain level of attention is always needed for any type of creative work? if somebody has ADHD, which is basically a part of it is attention deficit, so how they can actually do those creativity, or is it like for that particular creative work they are more focused?
Well, one thing that you'll find in any description of ADHD is that ADHD children and adults, because ADHD children grow up, many of them still have signs of ADHD when they grow up. And certainly some inattentive kids aren't caught when they're very young because their inattention is attributed to other things. But ADHD kids, even who are identified as ADHD, can hyperfocus. So they will stay focused for hours on something that really interests them. They'll say, how can he have ADHD? He can work on Legos for 2 hours, or he can, do this other thing for hours. And so if it's interesting and engaging and what you're doing, you can stay focused on it. So that, and if you think about it, if we just imagine as flies on the wall, which neither of us are, in a writing session for something like Saturday Night Live, people are probably bouncing ideas off each other,
Right.
And I say something and you say something, and then you think of something, and then I think of something with you think of something, and we're both really engaged in it, right?
Right.
And so that would sustain both of our focus because
Right.
we'd be really interested in it. It would be creative, and it would, one of the things I remember hearing about ADHD when I was in training is that the teacher would be talking about, well, we're going to give a star if you get the answer right. And the kid thinks stars. Well, stars are kind of cool. I mean, I heard that there's all these stars and they're way out there, and stars have planets. And wouldn't it be cool to be an astronaut and go visit planets? And what do you have to do to be an astronaut? Well, do I have to join the Air Force? And the kid is off.
Right.
He's in the Air Force.
Right. Right.
And, so there's all kinds of ways that, you can go if you're following, your pathway. And so, as I said, it's ideal for something where you're creative and you're taking things on and on. I wouldn't want an ADHD air traffic controller.
Right. Right. Okay, so that
And
actually,
one
go
more
ahead,
thing
please.
I want to throw in, and I'm sorry to interrupt,
No.
but school is, when I've seen in America anyway, when there's a survey of high school kids and they ask kids to describe school, many of them will say tiring and boring, because school is the only time when you have to study everything and be good at everything. And probably some significant part of it is boring and not that engaging for you.
Right.
And so we're expecting every kid to sustain attention to everything. And,
Right.
you went into cancer research and I went into psychology because that interested us. And maybe you don't want to have to sit down and write essays on Victorian literature.
Right.
That might not be your strength. But when you were in school, somebody wanted you to do that.
Right. Right. The subject matter, the approach has to be interesting. If the approach is interesting enough, then a person or a kid who doesn't even want to learn history, they can be motivated to learn history as well. So,
yeah, I do want to say, going back to where you started, that there are some kids, some people, adults as well, for whom sustaining attention is a necessary part of what they want to do, and they have difficulty getting started or sustaining attention or inhibiting distractibility, and that needs to be treated.
right.
And for them, of course, stimulant medication has been around for a very long time, and is the traditional first line of treatment, whether it's Ritalin or Effexor or Vyvanse. There's a whole list of medications that are used. One thing most people have never heard of is neurobiofeedback. And neurobiofeedback is a completely different approach that basically they use a EEG to monitor how the brain activity in different areas of the brain, and they basically teach the brain how to work more effectively. And the child or the person having the neurofeedback simply is watching a movie or playing a game, and when their brain isn't doing what the program is trying to do, it slows down. And the brain likes the pattern, the brain likes the speed. So the brain kind of learns, and you're not trying to make it learn, it learns. And the American Pediatric Association has actually approved neurobiofeedback as a first-line treatment for ADHD. And you might say, well, why haven't I heard of it, right? If it's a first-line treatment. And that's really simple. Pharmaceutical companies are the ones who sponsor research. And if you take a medication for ADHD, you're taking it once, maybe twice a day, every single day. That's a lot of pills.
Right, right.
And that makes a lot of money. Whereas if I'm going to be doing neurobiofeedback, I have to have a very powerful computer, but I buy the software once. Okay. And then I use that software with a lot of people, and they're constantly upgrading and updating the software. But basically, you're just selling it to one person who sees a lot of people. So financially, it's not the same kind of situation as somebody who's taking medication all the time. So they don't advertise.
Right.
They're not out there promoting it in the same way unless it happens to be a field you're interested in. And then you learn about it and you find that there are all kinds of applications of neurobiofeedback. So I do want to put in a mention of that because so many people listening to this podcast may never have heard of it. And it's an incredibly powerful tool. I've seen parents who have children diagnosed ADHD and who might give the child their first dose of Ritalin or Ritalin or Vyvanse or whatever they're giving them first thing in the morning, but it hasn't kicked in yet when the child has to go to school.
Right.
So the child's not necessarily cooperative, or the child's up there taking a 30-minute shower because they're in what we call ADHD time zone, where not necessarily monitoring how long things are taking. And so you want the child to be downstairs, and they got distracted because something was interesting. And, they suddenly got distracted by, oh, I want to go through all my t-shirts, or I was listening to something on the radio, or they got distracted and they're not ready, or they're not ready for breakfast or whatever. And the parent gets all mad and, sees the child as, not doing the right thing. And in fact, kid needs this medication and it hasn't kicked in yet. And the same thing happens at the end of the day. They give long release versions of stimulants so that there isn't a kind of curve that goes up and you kind of peak and then go down, and then you have to take another pill and it goes up and it goes down again. You want their attention to be sustained throughout the day. But by homework time, the child is probably, low on the medication. You don't want to give them another one often because you don't want to interfere with sleep. And so when it comes to homework time, the child's not probably on an adequate dose of medication.
Right.
And so again, you see some of the same problems with homework and getting the children to do homework. And they're probably fried from trying to concentrate all day anyway.
Right.
So at the beginning and end of the day, you can have problems that again get blamed on the child.
So why ADHD really happens? Is it genetic, or does it develop, with social interaction, or is it like after the birth, when the neurons are trying to find their path? How it actually happens, or it's like all of them together?
I would think that primarily ADHD is something that's genetic or something that you're born with. If any parent who has children know that they come out different,
Right.
and
Right.
they come out different to start with.
Okay.
It's not necessarily a function of, of learning or parenting.
Right.
You've got one temperament and you've got another temperament, and
Right.
they came out that way. I would imagine it's possible by exposure to toxins, by, a fetal alcohol syndrome, by, injury to affect somebody's attention and to affect their brain. But I think probably the majority of children are born, with that gene, and you often find a parent or someone in the families who has ADHD as well.
Okay. Okay. Got it. But could it also happen that if the child is completely, there is no genetic disorder, the social interaction or the parents' interaction somehow actually kind of initiated this kind of behavior or this kind of mental issues?
Well, this might be my own take on this, but I don't think so. I think
Okay.
that children who have ADHD have this kind of wiring, have this,
Okay.
so to put it in a very broad kind of way, and that they, and whether they're inattentive or hyperactive or, or both, or have, they have poor working memory. You tell the child to do three things, he only remembers the last one you told him to do.
Right.
All of that kind of thing can be, I think, largely something that you're born with. What I think might make a difference in parenting is the degree to which a parent is simply punitive, or, you're not doing a good enough job, and, you're a bad kid, basically, versus
Right.
a parent who is facilitating the child and using tools. And there's lots of books of, tools for, helping kids with ADHD, helping the child organize, helping the child, know how long something's taking. So there's a wonderful thing that's an ADHD tool, that's a clock that you can set, say, for 10 minutes, and it's red, and then as the time goes down, the red goes away, it covers the red. So the child can actually see how long 10 minutes are.
Okay.
And so that if you're supposed to be getting dressed for school and you have that, that as the red disappears, you have to have your clothes on and be out. So I think there are parents who facilitate their children navigating having ADHD better, as
Okay. Got
opposed
it.
as opposed to people who shame their children
Right.
for being stupid or unmotivated or disrespectful,
Right.
or all the things we call someone who's doing something that we don't want them doing.
So when this kind of issue children actually kind of manifests, then managing is actually the most important thing, and especially from the parents, starting from the parents, and if there is anybody out there who can help them clinically, then that would be very
Well,
helpful.
I think, parents can help children, you know, um, organize, can help their children, if you say to a child, I want you to pick up your room. Okay, maybe you're a child, I say, pick up your room.
Mhm.
And in your head, that means you take everything off the floor.
Right.
Maybe what I have in my head is that everything gets hung up, put away in drawers.
Right.
And, so if a parent might learn to be very clear and specific in directions, so the child doesn't have to hang on in working memory to directions. You might have a chart that lists exactly what the child is going to do. And that, reinforces the child, if in the morning you get up, you wash your face and brush your teeth, you put on your clothes, you get your backpack together, you push your backpack next to the door, you get a check for each of those. And then that's reinforcing because the child says, hey, I'm doing everything I'm supposed to do, as opposed to a child who's simply, okay, you're not doing a good job, you're supposed to be ready, you're not ready,
Right.
you don't
Right.
listen to me. Do you see what I mean?
Right. Right.
And
The instructions are not very clear in his head.
they need to be written down, because
Right.
working memory is holding things in your head. And so if you are talking to me, you're holding all kinds of things about me in working memory, probably because you're thinking about what to ask me next.
Right.
You're listening to me. And if you didn't have working memory, you need to have the strategy of having it all written down where you can glance down and see it, right? And you'd have to know how to organize it. And then when the child gets to school, they need that kind of support in
Right.
terms of, organizing themselves, being able to have some structure that helps them, anticipate what they're going to need to do, where they're going to need to put something, and to help the child with, say, transitions, or, let's say a child is impulsive and blurts out answers or raises their hand. And this is the child who's like this. Why? Because he's afraid if he doesn't have working memory, he's not going to remember what he wants to say.
Right.
Okay. So maybe we give him some paper and have him write down what he wants to say, and the teacher is sure to call on him so that he knows he will get a chance. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
So helping manage it, what a lot of times people think of helping with ADHD is just helping the child make sure they have all the books they need to bring home, and they have everything, in their backpack, and they have the letter that goes to the parents. But they might not realize that, as I said, built into learning, there's a lot of issues that are challenging if you have ADHD. Or maybe we have to look at how much homework is a child can be able to do in the evening, realistically, if the medication is wearing off. Or the child may not remember to take out the little book that has all the homework, or may not totally attend to every detail of what it says, so they missed that they were supposed to do something. And
Right.
so the parent may need to sit down with them and say, let's circle all the things you need to do. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Or do a
Yeah.
yellow highlighter over all the
Right.
operation signs and the math, so that you don't subtract when you should add. So there's a lot of, scaffolding, helping support the child, that you
Right.
want to do at school and at home.
Right.
And, I also had a child once that I saw, and this child had ADHD, and he wasn't a kid who could sit still. I mean, and he wasn't on medication. And his father came from a very authoritarian background where everybody had to sit at the table for all of dinner and participate in conversation. And it's interesting how rarely in dinner table conversation is intended to be interesting for kids.
Right.
We asked them, what was your homework? What did you do? Is there anything more boring than having to do you want to go home and talk about, some aspect of what you did that day that wasn't even interesting to you in the first place?
Exactly.
So, we're not saying, hey, what skateboard tricks did you learn? We're saying, what was your homework? So this kid's expected to sit there for the 3/4 of an hour that a very formal meal took, and he couldn't hold still. And sooner or later, he kicked his sibling, or he knocked over the water, or something happened, and the father would get all mad at him, and he would end up getting sent away, from the table. And my suggestion was that they allow the child to get up and move around and leave the room between courses.
Right.
And the father said, well, no, that's not how he did it. And I said, okay, well, you have a choice.
Right.
You can do it the way you want to, but this child's going to get in trouble and feel bad about himself, and you're going to be angry at him every single day. Or you can do it differently and help your child find a way to manage something that's difficult for him, and he'll be successful, and you won't have to be mad at him.
Mm-hmm.
So which would you prefer?
Right. Did he find a way?
Yeah, I mean, the father finally relented and, and let the child had a signal when he needed to get up and walk around and was allowed to go do something while everybody was sitting around waiting. And then they would let him know to come back, and that worked really well.
When you actually look at your patients and see that they have this kind of ADHD, do you also think that is it a part of autism as well?
Well, autism is different from
Autism
ADHD.
is different. Okay.
Autism is the criteria for autism focuses on social difficulties. It focuses on reading nonverbal cues. It focuses on repetitive behavior and being flexible and transitioning and social sensory issues. And there are very, people who are on the spectrum tend to be very kind of detailed, analytic thinkers, more logical thinkers. They tend to be incredibly responsible and very, um, and so you see that somebody with ADHD, their attention might be all over the place. They may not be focused so much on detail. Someone who's on the spectrum might be very focused on detail.
Okay.
Okay.
Right.
But I heard Tony Atwood, who's an expert on autism, recently in a talk talking about how as many as half of kids who have autism may also have ADHD. So
Right.
there's an enormous overlap because kids who have ADHD have social problems too, although
Right.
it might not be because they are confused about social behavior as much as they're not slowing down enough to pay attention to it. And there may be a lot of overlap in terms of executive functions, a lot of overlap in terms of sensory issues. And so you have somebody, I see a lot of people who are on the spectrum, and I often see people who are what they're now calling ADHD, autism ADHD. And
Hmm.
they kind of have a tug of war inside because the autistic part wants things to be organized and doesn't like spontaneity and, wants to go detail by detail. And the ADHD side, things are disorganized and I want to
Right.
do something and this is novel, let's go do it. And they feel this kind of tug of war between the part of them that wants this and the part of them wants that.
So when you are actually working with women, um, as you mentioned that historically there is a like kind of a gender biasness in detecting ADHD in males, of course, and women were ignored. So does it have any? I mean, of course, that is a social issue which is actually being changed now. But what I'm actually trying to understand is, as you mentioned, that not every um, kid actually manifests this kind of behavior equally. And is there any gender biasness, inherent biasness between males and females that how they manifest it?
Well, I think that for both ADHD and autism, there is gender bias. Certainly more boys are identified because I think the poster child for ADHD is the hyperactive boy. And more boys were identified on the spectrum because as very young children, girls are more aware of being different. Girls tend to play in groups more than boys. And so an autistic girl will be in the group or seen in the group, but not necessarily be as much part of the group because she's not picking up on the social cues and the social interactions. So she may be feeling very lonely. She may be feeling, very isolated and confused on the inside, but that's not what you necessarily see on the outside. So girls are being missed, and girls are also being missed with ADHD because they tend to be more inattentive. So you've got a lot of girls not being identified because they don't look like the poster child of the boy who has autism, who has women are told you don't look like Sheldon. You're not kind of robotic and flat and mechanical. You smile, you make eye contact, but that's because she's learned to mask. But also, I think the gender expectations of girls and boys are quite different.
Right.
So that a boy who is really active, well, there's more of a boys will be boys kind of attitude.
Right.
Whereas girls are supposed to be people pleasers, and girls are supposed to be more submissive, and girls are supposed to do what they're told. So a girl who is having difficulty sustaining attention or remembering what it is you want her to do, or a girl who might be impulsive, a girl who is on the spectrum and is processing differently and not behaving in the way that you want her to because maybe she's having too many sensory issues or for whatever, there's more disapproval of girls because the social expectations of girls are different. So girls tend to get called rude or oppositional or, a whole list of names because they're not meeting gender expectations and we're not identifying what the underlying issue is.
Okay. Once both boys and girls, they hit puberty and they still have the ADHD, does the hormonal regulation actually has any role in this ADHD development?
It's a great question because really ADHD in females hadn't been studied, and it turns out that hormonal variation has a huge impact on girls, that as the estrogen builds up, that has an effect on mood, it has effect on activity, it has effect on lability, and then as it goes down, that there can be more depression, there can be more negative affect, but there can also be more acting out coming out of that negative affect. And when you have girls on the spectrum, they also are very impacted by hormones. And especially when you have a girl who's ADHD and on the spectrum, you have a lot of trouble with emotional regulation that corresponds with, having a menstrual cycle. So that's something that nobody paid attention to when they were studying all boys.
Right. Okay. So is that kind of study going on now by any chance?
There are. There's a number of people studying it. I just happen to have this book.
Oh, nice. ADHD girls to women. Oh, wow. This is actually very to the point.
Right. And Lotta Borg-Skoglund is one of the researchers in Sweden who is doing research on ADHD in girls. And she and I have been talking about this overlap with autism and ADHD and looking into it together. So I'm really excited about that, but I highly recommend her book.
Okay. Okay. Awesome. That would be great. Wow.
There's also an organization called CHAD, which is children with hyperactivity and attention deficit, that has a lot of programs for kids with ADHD. There are programs, there are organizations that not quite as many and well organized for children on the spectrum, but that's starting to be dealt with.
Okay.
Which is why I'm writing a book.
Right.
But I think finding supports for families who are dealing with children who are different and the prejudices and stigma that is attached to having a child who's different is something that a lot of families are having to deal with, and they need support for that.
Right. Okay. So how did you actually started focusing on women particularly, instead of, going with the flow?
Going with the flow. Well, I'd say that, we have to kind of trace this back to where I started.
Sure.
And I started out being trained both as a therapist and doing neuropsychological testing. And as I did neuropsychological testing, I found there were kids who had a certain kind of pattern. And these were kids who often weren't well understood. And so I became interested, and these were kids who had social issues. These were kids who tended to be very inflexible, difficult as their parents saw them. And these kids, at first, I began to learn a lot about nonverbal learning disabilities. And it's interesting because Tim Walsh, who is a vice presidential candidate, has talked about his son who
Right.
has a nonverbal learning disability, which is actually a neuropsychological profile. It's not a psychiatric diagnosis, but these kids have issues taking in information through the verbal channel. And that was many of the kids that I was seeing, that they had verbal intellectual capacity that was way up here, but their nonverbal processing was more down here. And as one little boy told me, it's like my mind is the road runner and this other part of me is the coyote, you
Huh.
know. And
Interesting.
so I started becoming interested in these kids and writing about them and seeing them. And the neuropsychological profile of NLD tended to also be the neuropsychological profile of children who were Asperger's, which is now considered part of the autistic spectrum. And so I found myself moving into not just children who were identified as having a nonverbal learning disability, but children who were on the autistic spectrum and learning about them. And so as I was writing things like explanations aren't excuses, so that if you had a child who wasn't doing what you wanted, okay, the child was only doing the last thing you said, child with ADHD, or the child was for the nonverbal learning disability child, was only taking in things through the verbal channel. So mom says, this bag is really heavy. And the child goes, and they go into the house, and then mom's mad. And, well,
Hmm.
why are you mad? Because you didn't offer to help carry the bag. Well, you didn't ask me to help carry the bag, right? That was supposed to be inferred. That was nonverbal by the face mom made when she said the bag was heavy, but the kid's not picking up on the face. So I started writing about how understanding these children isn't an excuse for behavior, it's an explanation, so we know how to explain something, how to be direct, how to tell somebody exactly what we want them to do, all this sort of stuff. So I got interested in the children who were Asperger's and what they were like, and kept moving on. And what I started reading about was how girls were underidentified. And I became very interested in that. And what I discovered is that unidentified girls grew up to be unidentified women. And one of the aspects of being on the spectrum, if you are missing social cues, right now you have your hand like this and you're kind of furrowing your brow a little bit, that's all nonverbal, okay?
Right.
And if you sort of did something different, that might signal, oh, she's not saying something interesting. Okay. But if I'm on the spectrum, I miss that. Or if I have nonverbal learning disability, I miss that. I miss that cue that tells me I'm on track or I'm not on track. Okay. And so kids who are on the spectrum, and a lot of kids with NLD, feel they don't fit in because they're missing cues. And people have written that as much as 50 to 70% of social emotional communication is nonverbal. I might say something like, get out of here. Okay. And then I might say, get out of here. Those mean two different things, but I said exactly the same thing. If you're only tuning in to what I said, you heard the same thing. But picking up on the tone of voice is not verbal. Okay. So if you're only picking up on what I said and not the nonverbal cues, you don't know what I mean. And especially if you're relying on what's verbalized and not what's non-verbalized, you might see me a week from now and say, oh, it's so nice to see you. Why don't we make it time to get together. You might not mean any of that. You might just be being polite.
Right.
But if I don't pick the nonverbal cues up, I think you want to see me next week. And okay, when do we meet? What's our time? And you're embarrassed because that's not what you meant. So girls who are but this is inside. And if somebody has sensory issues, let's say they're very sensitive to sound, or they're very sensitive to smell, and they're around someone wearing strong perfume, or it's a very noisy environment, she might be having a very strong reaction that's very emotionally, throwing her off, but nobody knows why. Nobody knows what's going on inside. And so she's getting a lot of negative feedback that you're a drama queen. Okay, you just want attention. Or, you always are saying no, everything has to be your way. Or you don't listen to what I say, or whatever. And she can develop a sense of shame and a sense of failure, that I never fit in and people are always telling me I'm wrong. And so often girls who grow up into women who aren't diagnosed are struggling to understand themselves. Why don't I fit in? Why can't I do what other people seem to do so easily? But nobody's ever picked up on it, even when they have as many autistic traits as boys, because you don't see it, because they don't present in the same way. So I got very interested in women who had been undiagnosed. So there's a track from neuropsych testing that ends me up with diagnosing undiagnosed women, because what I felt for were kids who were being reprimanded and made to feel bad about themselves for reasons that weren't understood and that they didn't understand, to adults who are feeling that way, because children grow up into being adults. And if they still haven't been identified, they're still struggling with all that. So I have women coming to me who are 18 and 20, and I have women who are coming to me who are 60 and who are still struggling to understand themselves and to have a sense of being empowered and pride in themselves. What I tell them is, you're not a broken PC, you're a Mac. You have a different operating system,
Right.
but you're a fine computer,
Yeah.
but you have to run you're stuck running programs that maybe you weren't built for.
Right.
And so I'll give you an example. Okay. When you go to a school and there's something, a presentation in the auditorium. Okay. Or you go to a shopping mall at Christmas time and there's music playing and people are spraying cologne on everybody who walks by and all that. If you have sensory issues, okay, or then loud clapping is going to be, very
Yeah.
difficult,
Yeah.
or having that kind of smell is going to be very difficult. And if you go to a conference where people are on the spectrum, people do that.
Right.
Shows that they're, applauding, but they're not doing it in a noisy way. I mean, there's no and shopping malls actually in the US, many of them have quiet time before they open at Christmas time, where the lights are lower and they don't turn on the music and nobody's spraying perfume, where somebody who has sensory issues can shop. So they're beginning to make accommodations for people,
Yes.
but they're still thinking mostly of children. They're not necessarily realizing that they're dealing with hundreds of thousands of unidentified adults.
Right. Right. Okay, let's get into your blog. And you told me before we actually got to talk a little, where you started the blog and you started writing uh, partly with your experience with the kids and the women you met. So could you actually tell me that how you started it and what kind of compelled you?
To do it.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting, I think, in a way, because as a clinician, I had immense respect for all the people who were in academics and research. And I had a kind of inferiority complex that as a clinician, did I have anything of value to say? And then over time, I began to realize that you know, I understood these kids and these adults in a way that the people who were doing research didn't. You might do a factor analysis on them, but I knew what it was like to be them. And so I knew what the family issues were. And so I wanted to help people understand what the experience of kids is like. And so early on, I was writing more about kids with, who are either nonverbal learning disability or autistic, and kind of what their experience was, what they were running into. And this is a digression, but you might be interested in using it. When I was in school, I was a very bright student, but I didn't know it, but I had a learning disability, and my learning disability is dysgraphia and in writing. And so I, to this day, cannot handwrite a note and not leave words out. So for me, the word processor was a lifesaver. But back in the day when I was taking school, there weren't laptops and there weren't word processors, and I had to write everything out by hand. And I was always leaving out words or not forming them correctly. And teachers told me I was the worst writer they'd ever seen. Okay. And that's how I saw myself. And that's kind of how I ended up in science. Because in science, they weren't asking me to do as much writing, and I understood what I was doing. And I did a project that ended me up in an international science fair, and everyone said, "Oh, look, you're really good in science." So, there I went into science. And afterwards, I went into psychology. But when I first started in psychology, my writing was more academic, neuropsychological test reports, things like that. And I got asked to do a column for a web magazine that was ahead of its time as the working mom shrink. And the editor taught me how to write in a voice that was sort of more fun and more sassy. And I learned that I actually was a very good writer, and that the mechanics of writing had always kept me from writing.
Right.
So I decided as I was learning this that I really liked writing, because it gave me a way to express some of what I knew and I understood that I wanted to communicate to other people. And I would have a platform like Psychology Today or somewhere like that. And I could say, what I observed or what I thought, and people, and share it with people. And that as a clinician, I did have something to say in my understanding of. So that's how I got into writing.
Okay.
And I was interested in, so as I said, I was writing a lot about for nonverbal learning disabilities and then autism. And I was contacted by somebody who was the head of an incredible website that's by and for people on the spectrum called Neuroclastic, who said, "You kind of get it. And so, come, be part of this group that's all autistic." And, and I met people, and everything I had learned was wrong. These are people who very much wanted to be connected to other people, who were very funny, who had very dry and witty senses of humor, who could be very supportive, who, showed each other a lot of encouragement. And, it's this world that nobody saw because people were struggling through that social gap. And, and responding to people in terms of, well, you're not doing it the way I would do it. So I'll give you one example. Let's say that you tell me you're really upset because your cat died.
Mm-hmm.
And you would expect me to come over, and maybe I'd put my arm around you if I knew you well enough, or I'd say just, I'm so sorry, losing an animal is terrible. And someone on the spectrum might say, oh, my cat died too. And what they're trying to say is, I understand.
Right.
They're not saying it in the way you expect. And so you might say, well, that person's very self-focused. She's thinking about herself and not about me.
Oh,
But
right,
in
right,
fact, what she's communicating is, I understand, I've been through this too.
right.
And people may not show emotion in the same way. So I was dealing with a young man who had been arrested for having caused an accident, and it was completely accidental, by the way. He, was wet and he skidded, but he was being accused of having done it on purpose.
Wow.
And he said that, it completely was an accident, and that he cared very deeply about the people who were hurt, and he was going to, do everything he could to help provide money to that family as he got a job. And he's only 20, as he got a job, and he would do anything he could to help that family. And the prosecutor said that he obviously showed no remorse because he never cried. So again, this person is struggling to have themselves be understood, but the behavior that's being looked for isn't what they're exhibiting. And so
Yeah.
there's this social gap of understanding and being, understood.
Yeah.
So I was writing about that. And once I was really seeing people close up, I was writing more about it. And I ended up writing a blog about autistic children in school. My blogs gave me lots of opportunities to speak and, requests to speak for groups and things like that. But one of the things that I was really interested in and concerned about is that because there's this tendency to just look at behavior and not look at experience, that autistic kids in school were constantly being treated as if their behavior was only because they were autistic. It was basically non-functional. And so conforming to typical behavior is what is expected and was the gold standard of working well with them. When in fact, a child might be doing a non-conforming behavior because they're sensorily overwhelmed, or because the social demand, people don't realize school is nonstop social demand.
Yeah.
You sit in the classroom and people may be working, but somebody might look at you and roll their eyes.
Yeah.
And, there's all this social demand, or demand to transition from one class to another, or there's just all these demands that these kids are trying to deal with. But when they don't do them smoothly, when the kid stands there and, crying or screaming because they're and no one says, oh, maybe this is social sensory overwhelm.
Yeah.
Nobody ever thinks of that. They just think of she's attention seeking, or she's avoiding being in class, or something like that. So these kids are constantly getting feedback that what you're doing is bad, or that what we need to do is extinguish what you're doing. I had one girl in Spanish class, and this was in high school, and she would draw on her iPad. Well, you shouldn't draw on your iPad in Spanish. So there was a plan that she would get one warning, and if she didn't put away her iPad, it would get taken away from her the second time. And so they did that, and it got taken away from her, and she put her head on the desk and she was crying. And the teacher said, well, your head's on the desk. If you're so tired, you can go to the nurse, which embarrassed the girl in front of the entire class. And what no one bothered with is that it was a very rowdy class with lots of boys who made lots of noise. She couldn't stand the sensory experience, and the only way she could calm herself was to draw. But nobody understood that. So these kids go through this over and over and over again. And so I wrote a blog on how, and I was on the clinical advisory group of an organization called aane.org, which is the Association for Autism and Neurodiversity, and was talking to some of the people on that board and said, I think these kids all come out with trauma. And the guy was the head of it, said, yes, I think all these kids come out traumatized. So I wrote a blog on, do autistic kids get PTSD in school? And much to my surprise, 257,000 people read it.
Yeah.
And I was getting all kinds of emails from people saying, this is my life. This is my story. This is my children's story. I can't get the school to understand it. I try to, and please, do something and write a book so I can bring it into school. And that's how I ended up writing a book for my blog, and from sharing something that turned out to be the experience of so many people.
I think we have talked about this as well very briefly, that how you actually came to science. And you also told me that by the time you went to the college, you already knew about how what you're going to do. So in my experience, I have taught many students, and most of them, when they are in freshman in college, this is a little bit different question compared to what your expertise in. But I think this is your life experience that I'm talking about. That they are very confused. They don't know what to do. And they always say that I'm figuring it out. So that's what they actually think. It didn't happen in my case. I always kind of knew that what I'm going to do. Uh, Not particularly brain cancer, but in general, like in the science. Um, do you have any suggestion that how students can find out their path? Because if they find out their path early in the days, then it's always better for them to be more successful because they have enough time in their hand and all those things. So do you have any suggestions on that?
Well, I'm smiling because I'm going to disagree with you.
I think we have talked about that as well.
Yeah, but I think that there are many factors that go into that.
Mhm.
I think that we can help children by encouraging them in their areas of strength, because you never know what something will turn into.
Right.
The kid who loves to constantly be drawing may end up being an architect. And so encouraging children to do what interests them, and even if it doesn't make them a star, even if it doesn't make them an academic success, but it's something that they're good at, is certainly one way to help them discover their passion, to discover their interest. I think that in school, if you are lucky enough to have a talented teacher who really engages you in a subject, you might discover that that really interests you. And there are certainly some kids like yourself who know that they want to go into science, or they know they want to be a doctor, or they know they want to do something. But I think the grand majority of kids really don't know. I mean, and kind of how would you? I mean, first of all, their knowledge of what kinds of things to do out there are kind of limited to their experience, which is what? High school, right? Middle school. And they're not exposed to, for example, what are all the things people do when they work in a TV studio? Okay. What does it mean to be an audio engineer? I mean, how would you
Right.
know that if you were in middle school? Do you
Yeah,
know what I mean?
exactly.
And so they don't necessarily know what's out there. I think having work opportunities for kids is a great thing to do, so that a child can, internships, say in middle school or high school, where you get to go somewhere and try out what's it like. When my daughter was in college, she'd always been what we call a fashionista. She was always way ahead of what was in fashion. And she went to work for a very famous designer who I will not name.
Uh-huh.
And she was so talented at it, they ended up having her pull all the accessories for the photo shoots. And she came out of it and said, I'm never working for a designer. They're all crazy. And then she went and worked for W Magazine, and, which again writes about all this. And she said, well, I'm not doing that because it's really interesting. They don't make any money. So, so she had opportunities to explore her interests in the work world, okay, in real life situations, and, and discovered some of what she didn't want to do. And so I think giving kids the opportunity to develop their passions, a chance to sort of experience real world working. If you have a child who's really interested in animals, they get to a certain age, can they work at a vet's? Can they be the one who helps give animals, their exercise, or the one who, works with animals? Can you give kids a chance to sort of do that kind of thing?
Right.
But Dan Levinson wrote a wonderful book called Seasons of a Man's Life. And of course, we're talking about men, right? But the same thing is true for women, which is you have all your interests, okay? You have interest in a lot of things. And as you get to your 20s, when you separate from home, you start to individuate and become a person and you explore what it is you like. So maybe my daughter explored being in fashion, or I explored, doing one thing or another. And it's kind of like Jacob and the coat of many colors in the Bible. You try things on.
Right.
And you say, well, what is it like if I go into this field? And
Right.
you go into the field, and maybe you go to med school and it's an incredible success. Or maybe you go into med school and you absolutely hate it.
Right. Right.
And there are so many people who their career isn't like this. Their career is like this.
Right.
Because they are kind of trying things out and discovering that, well, I thought I wanted to be an engineer, but actually I'm much more interested in this other thing, and so the idea is you try out different things, and then you find something that seems to be satisfying for you, and you do that for a while, but then you get to a certain age, around 30, where, okay, I've tried all these things, and now I start really settling down. I do this, I live here, I'm in this kind of relationship, and you kind of choose a path. But then when you get to 40, you might discover that the path you chosen, okay, I'm successful, I made it as a lawyer, but I don't feel my life is very meaningful. And they go back and they train as social workers.
Right. Right.
So, I think there's a path of discovering what you're good at, discovering what interests you, discovering what it means to be in that situation and do that work. And so I think it's a lifelong process of growth that is there for many people. I know when I was in college, as I said, I wasn't good at writing, and I was, good at science. So I was told that's what I did. I remember my mother saying she's going to be a research biochemist if it kills her. And it nearly did, since I was spending 14 hours a week in lab.
Yeah.
But, when I graduated, I took a job, and I found it really interesting working with people and working with communities and exploring how people dealt with the drug problem. And then I was looking for another job, and someone said, you have to go to graduate school. And I'm like, oh, okay. And I had no idea what I wanted to go into graduate school. I didn't want to go to medicine because I was afraid I'd get sick.
Okay.
But, did I want to go into psychology, sociology, anthropology,
Right.
mental science, law? I mean, all of it interested me, right?
Right. Yeah.
Interested in, so I decided I would sit down and read the journals of all these different fields and see which one was the most interesting, and psychology won. So I got a PhD in psychology, but I certainly didn't come out of college with a clear sense of, oh, this is it.
Got it. Okay.
I got a job, and then I got to the point where, okay, how do I explore what's out there? And I explored it. But even in being a psychologist, I've done neuropsych testing. I've taught at the college level. I've written, I've given talks, I see patients, I do consulting, I do training. So I've had the opportunity to do a lot of different kinds of things. And so, the idea that when if you're 6 year old and you're a gifted musician, okay, I'm going to give you lessons in the violin and you're going to come out being Itzhak Perlman. That might be true for Itzhak Perlman, but it might not be true for another kid. We were the first class to graduate as undergraduates at Yale, as female undergraduates.
Oh, okay.
So the first women came to Yale in 1969, and some came as freshmen, some came as sophomores, and I was in the class that came in as juniors. So we were the oldest. We all were transfers. I was transferring from Clark, where I was a science major. And one of the things that attracted me about Yale, they had a co-ed week where they invited women to come and participate in classes, is that nobody seemed bothered by the fact that I was smart. And, many women, and I think this is true for if you look at women like Hillary Clinton and Kamala Harris and other women, if you're smart and independent and, speak your mind, you get a fair amount of flack for it.
Right.
Nobody criticizes how men's hair is being done or whether they're wearing the right clothes, right? And so I got told I was too smart.
Oh, wow.
And I didn't really want to dumb it down. And so
Right.
I was very happy at Clark. I was just elected to student government, but Yale went co-ed, and I thought, well, that was interesting. So I applied, and much to my shock, I got in.
Right.
And we were all supposed to be Amazons, we were. And one thing that a professor did say is that the women and the people that were admitted then who were non-traditional, including people who had to be work study, is that we had to be really smart to get in. And so therefore, Yale had a history of having a lot of students who were legacies, which means that their parents had gone to Yale, so they went to Yale, and it was sort of like a network. And we came in and we were going to learn, and we were going to work hard. And so the professor said we kind of raised the level of discourse a bit.
Oh,
But what I found out and didn't appreciate at the time was that they basically picked us to be smart, independent, and not need any help because they weren't going to give us any. So there was never any time when they brought even the women together,
right.
or there was no support group for women.
Yeah.
And there was just, here you are, go.
Right. Right. I understand. Oh, wow. That's
So most of us, we did a survey among ourselves years later and discovered most of us felt isolated. Most of us felt somewhat alienated. And really what we did is we all worked hard. So we had better grades the first quarter,
right.
which totally was, like, oh my God, they're taking over. And, nobody noticed that the University of Vienna had women starting in 1700. So it was like Yale had invented women. But I didn't really appreciate it. I didn't take
Right.
science that seriously. People had told me I was good at science, but wasn't necessarily, I just sort of floated into things, and I floated into Yale. And it wasn't until one of my reunions when all the women got together that I looked around and I said, my God, what exciting, interesting people. And hey, I'm one of them.
Yeah.
And so it really gave me a sense of empowerment that, we were brought to be independent, and we were brought to be, you know, self-motivated, and to, and all of us were. And I really had a sense of respect, both for the women that I had gone to school with, but also, as I said, for myself as a clinician and what I had to offer. So it paid off in the long run.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that experience. I mean, this is exceptionally inspiring, and for a lot of people, definitely for women who are actually still, trying to find their way in the world. I personally think that it's almost not almost, it should be a movie as well, like any of those inspiring movies. The first women batch of Yale. So that would be fascinatingly inspiring. I really like inspiring movies. So I actually watch a lot of inspirational movies. Like one of those are October Sky.
That was wonderful.
That's a wonderful movie,
Yeah.
and many of them. I think the other one is, I'm forgetting the name. I love that movie. Those I think four African American women who were in NASA for the
Yeah.
first.
Yeah. I know. And they were Black, if I remember.
Yes,
They weren't allowed to even use the bathroom.
yes, yes,
And but they actually did all of the calculations pre-computers for Apollo
exactly.
13.
Who that put John Glenn in
Right,
space.
right.
So that was amazing, and
Yeah. Well, just to give you a sense where we started,
uh-huh.
okay. When I got to Yale, there was already a department of Black studies, and there was and so one of the women approached a professor of history and said, should there be a department of women's studies? And he said, well, there's no department of dog studies.
Wow, really?
Yeah. My class particularly had this as a, as a huge problem from our peers. But I know when I went into the work world or when I went to start doing things and I was successful, I had asked, well, what did I do to him to get him to say that? And, I think that it took a long time for women in general to be empowered to say, hey, you have to take us seriously for who we are. And by the way, we're a market. And if you're talking that way, we're not going to buy what you're selling.
Right.
And so, I think we were kind of on the vanguard of empowering women to be strong and not to give a plug for us, but as you know, I'm in my 70s and my peers at school are in our 70s and we're all still going strong.
Yeah.
And I think that there's a new model of, I think older women in our society were expected to sort of disappear.
Right.
And, you hear about that in theater, you hear about that in movies, that there's no role for,
Yes, yes,
for
of course.
older women.
Unless you are Meryl Streep.
Right. If you're Meryl Streep,
Right.
but, I think that we are saying no, women have a contribution to make and we have a strong contribution to make. And just because we're older, we don't disappear. We still have things to say. We still are in leadership positions. And it's a different model of what it looks like to get older.
Right.
As and I am not going to be invisible. Thank you.
Yes, of course. It's very interesting also that if you see, and this is probably kind of like an on the psychological thought process that Hollywood has and had and still has, that when they think about um, older actresses who are now, like Meryl Streep, and I forgot the English woman. I'm forgetting her name. Anyway, Judy Dench. So these, I don't remember that they were very successful, like super successful in their younger ages. It's somehow that Hollywood has an idea that it's like probably kind of a male kind of idea that I have seen you and kind of thought of you as a very vibrant young actress in many movies. So I don't want to see you in your old age.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, you're totally right. I mean, Meryl Streep and some other actresses, Jamie Lee Curtis,
Right.
um, uh, for example, who was just in a movie I saw, and I'm not remembering the name of it, but
She's doing more movies there in last couple of years.
yeah, but she was in Bear, okay, which is the TV show that's been so incredibly successful, and she's the mother, and she looks very aged, but women are criticized for aging.
Right.
Women are criticized for allowing themselves to have wrinkles. And I think Sally Field is another one who was
Right. Right.
criticized for aging
Right.
and, not having cosmetic surgery so that we all look like, Jane Fonda or,
Yeah.
you know, um, I'm blanking on her name. She played
Oh, yeah. Julia Roberts.
Julia Roberts. We don't all look like Julia Roberts. And,
Right.
if you're a woman and you let your hair go gray, which obviously I didn't, and but your face is showing signs of age, people criticize it. They actually comment on, that there's something wrong with you or there's something
Right.
bad. I've yet to hear anybody say anything about Jeff Bridges
Right.
or
Exactly.
Clooney. I mean, men are allowed to age.
Right.
Men are, and if anything, gray hair makes them look distinguished.
Right.
Sir Anthony Hopkins,
Right.
who, by the way, is also on the spectrum.
Oh, really?
It's Asperger's, yes, if anybody
Oh,
that, but, men are allowed to age, men are allowed to look older,
right.
whereas women aren't. If you are
Yeah.
not young and attractive, then, as I said, older women should disappear.
And how many women actually kind of basically went through physical mutilation, to stay relevant in that field, like Botox injection and all those things,
Right.
which basically destroyed neurons in your face, right? It's just,
Well, I think that, I think the message to women basically is that you are decorative. You know, you are valued for your looks.
right.
And if you don't look young and attractive, then there's something wrong with you. I mean, look what's being criticized about. I'm going back to Hillary Clinton. Her voice was too strident, her hair was this, her pantsuit was that. And, who cares about a man's hairdo?
Right. Right.
A man speaks decisively, he's seen as assertive, right? And
Right.
so you see all these actors who are older actors. I'm old, but when I was around when Mick Jagger was a kid, right? If you told me Mick Jagger would be in his 70s jumping around the stage singing Rolling Stone songs, I would have thought you were crazy.
Right.
And yet he does.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Sir
Yes.
Elton
Yeah.
John, Sir Paul McCartney, all these people, they're in their
Exactly.
70s and they're still out there doing concerts.
Well, yeah. Yeah.
And so
Still.
men are allowed to be older.
Right. Yeah. I think the narrative it's changing. It's going to change eventually. It's kind of like social evolutionary process, like biological evolutionary process, just takes time. From monkey to becoming human, it just took millions of years. So at least the social evolution is faster than that.
Well, so nice to talk to you.
Great talking to you. Thank you for your time. Really, really appreciate it.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you for watching, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more insights into science, history, medicine, and much more. Till next time, keep exploring.